Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at chapter number 3 of this book, The Ego Tunnel by Thomas Metzingers. Let me start out by reading you the same excerpt that we ended up with last time, because this will help you reconnect with what we've already discussed. And it sort of lays out, the endeavor of this chapter. So here it goes. How to comprehend subjectivity is the deepest puzzle in consciousness research. In order to overcome it, we must understand how the conscious self was born into the tunnel, how nature managed to evolve a centered model of reality, creating inner worlds that not only appear, but that appear to someone. We must understand how the consciousness tunnel turned into the ego tunnel. So in this chapter, we will look at the following themes. In what follows, we will be looking at how the body image comes about, according to Metzingers. We will also get a feeling for how it can be manipulated. And we will then get into the question, what possible role could that have played in evolutionary terms, so to speak. So, we can start out with owning your body, its sensations and its various parts is fundamental to the feeling of being someone. So, in the following, this feeling of being someone is also termed a sense of ownership. Next, the consciously experienced sense of ownership is directly determined by representational processes in the brain. Now, while on the face of it that sounds absolutely rational, I just want to interject here that there is the term determined here implies that there is a causal link, between what is happening, between what the processes that are going on in your brain and what you actually experience, and that harks back to this assumption that there is a causal link between the materiality of your brain and your experiences, which in itself is an assumption. I just wanted to make that clear for what it's worth. We do get an indication of neuroimaging studies that were conducted that show which part of the brain are activated when we do have such a sense of ownership, and that seems to be the place of the locus of the premotor cortex. Recently, psychometric studies have shown that the feeling of having a body is made up of various subcomponents, the three most important being ownership, agency, and location, which can be dissociated. Next, we get into the topic of so-called behavioral space, and the phenomenal self-model that we have, and how tool use, like us using tools, plays into that. Any successful extension of behavioral space is mirrored in the neural substrate of the body image in the brain. So basically, and we can have, we have images of experiments with humans and then also with monkeys that have humans or monkeys move an object using their hand first, and then later on moving the same object using a tool. And what was found was that apparently what happens in the cases where tools were used is that our brains seem to integrate the tool into the virtual representation that we have of ourselves. So whereas before, sort of like you or the image of yourself stops with your hand, when you use a tool, the tool is now integrated into that bodily self-image. And this sort of integration, or our ability, one should say, of integrating tools into our self-image, bodily self-image, that is, seems to be a precondition for us to use tools successfully. And there you have an indication of what, from an evolutionary perspective, what role that plays. So, you could argue that nature made it so that we can actually use tools successfully and evolve. And it might be closer for you, the analogy of when, for instance, you heard people who ride motorbikes say, I was one with my motorbike when they were most successfully driving it. So this was actually personal interjection here. This was the motorbike I rode back in the day, and I can attest to the feeling of feeling one with it. So, and it does become sort of like an extension of one's own body, or body image, I should say. So this sort of extension of behavioral space translates to an extension of the phenomenal self-model that you have in your brain. You can engage in goal-directed and intelligent tool use only if your brain temporarily represents the tools as part of yourself. Now, a question that is interesting is what happens if what would happen if you were able to perceive your whole body as a tool, and that's what he's looking at next. Perhaps most exciting from a philosophical perspective is the idea that all of this may have contributed to the evolutionary emergence of a quasi-Cartesian meta-self, the capacity to distance yourself from your bodily self, namely by beginning to see your own body as a tool. There is a link between selfhood and extending global control. It now looks as if even the evolution of language, culture, and abstract thought might have been a process of acceptation, of using our body maps for new challenges and purposes, a point to which I return in the chapter on empathy and mirror neurons. It might be worthwhile to interject a definition here. So acceptation means a shift of function towards a certain trait in the process of evolution. So we haven't found out yet whether the whole body can be seen as a tool, and whether we can develop a sort of meta sense of our own self. But I think what's interesting here is that even language, culture, and abstract thought could be regarded as such tools, essentially, extensions of ourselves. And you then would give those factors a whole different sort of meaning, if you think about it. The idea is that having an integrated bodily self-model was an extremely useful new trait because it made a host of unexpected acceptations possible. The self-model is an integrated representation of the organism as a whole in the brain. Its content is the content of the ego. We talked about that. Those are just the text passages to sort of drive this point home. Now, it's important here at this juncture to make clear how Metzinger uses the term ego. He equates the term with the conscious self model, and also later in the text we see that he will equate the term ego with the locus of knowledge, agency, and conscious experience. Now that we have a general idea of why nature evolved the ego model or ego-centered model of reality in the first place, Metzinger sets out to deconstruct this self-model in order to inquire whether there is some kind of minimal phenomenal experience of selfhood. So in the context of this phenomenal self-model that we have, the phenomenon of out-of-body experiences is interesting to look at. And Metzinger both reports his own experiences. He actually did have several OBEs, which is quite interesting. And he also interjects, reports from other people, third parties who had OBEs. Now, the classical defining characteristics of an OBE include a visual representation of one's body from a perceptually impossible third-person perspective. For example, lying on the bed below, plus a second representation of one's body, typically hovering above. Metzinger tried to see if he could sort of turn his own out-of-body experiences into a controllable and replicable state of consciousness, so as to make it accessible for science purposes, but he didn't succeed. He writes, "I was never able to go beyond pure first-person phenomenology, that is, to make a single verifiable observation in the OBE state that could even remotely count as evidence for the genuine separability of consciousness and the brain." Now, the question, of course, you might have is why OBEs are interesting to research from a philosophical perspective. And Metzinger writes, "OBEs are interesting for a number of reasons. The phenomenology of OBEs inevitably leads to dualism and to the idea of an invisible, weightless, but spatially extended second body. Another reason is that it is the best known state of consciousness in which two self-models are active at the same time." To me, that wasn't so self-evident when I read this. I guess it still isn't, but OBEs are valuable because they allow us to distinguish any possible functional layers in the conscious human self. That makes sense. And next, we will look at another interesting question, and that is in the context of OBEs, how that could have had an impact on humans to believe that there is something like a soul, how having OBEs could make you feel that there is a soul, and hence the whole concept of having souls could have, come out of this. So he says, "I believe this may actually be the folk phenomenological ancestor of the notion of a soul and of the philosophical proto-concept of the mind. In its origins, the soul may have been not a metaphysical notion, but simply a phenomenological one. The content of the phenomenological ego activated by the human brain during out-of-body experiences. My theory, the self-model theory of subjectivity, says that this subtle body does indeed exist, but it is not made of angel stuff or astral matter. It is made of pure information flowing in the brain. a further proof point for materialists, obviously, is if you can replicate such states by manipulating the brain, from in terms of materially manipulating it by introducing some kind of stimulation, So if you were able to stimulate certain conscious states by, stimulating brain regions, then that would speak for a causal link of the two. And he writes, under certain conditions, the brains of all human beings can generate OBEs. There may well be a spatially distributed but functionally distinct neural correlate for the OBE state. Now, he says that science has been able to not only stimulate such OBEs, but also the actual feeling or the sensation of there being a presence, in terms of a presence other than oneself. And that they were able to do that by direct electrical brain stimulation. So, it is what it is. Apparently, that is what's happening. Now that we learned about, how we can integrate tools in our bodily self-image, to get things done, and now that we also have an idea of what OBEs are and how they can occur naturally, a next interesting question is if out-of-body experiences can be fully replicated using artificial means. The guiding question was whether there could be an integrated kind of bodily self-consciousness that is a phenomenal confabulation. In short, could one experience a hallucinated and a bodily self at the same time, a full-body analog of the rubber hand illusion? In order to research this, Metzinger collaborated with a neurologist at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, and they used VR glasses, virtual reality glasses. And in their studies, participants experienced a form of sort of body ownership over a virtual body that was tactically synchronized with their own body. So the findings indicated that participants could be led to identify with the virtual body to a significant extent. So this illusion was sort of reinforced through multi-sensory integration, where visual feedback of the virtual body movements was paired with tactile sensations on the real body. So this led to changes in the perception of the self and body ownership, and that demonstrates how external stimuli can alter our sense of corporal identity. And the reason they were studying the experience of, disembodiment in the first place was in order to understand what an embodied self truly is, So the results they found contribute to our understanding of just body representation in the brain and the mechanisms underlying the body ownership. And they highlight the role of multisensory experiences in self-perception. And in this context, Metzinger talks about the embedding principle. With regards to the embedding principle, he writes, the bodily self is phenomenally represented as inhabiting a volume in space, whereas the seeing self is an extensionless point, namely the center of projection for our visio-spatial perspective, the geometrical origin of our perspectival visual model of reality. That's quite intuitive. I mean, you don't sense, for instance, that your whole body is looking, but you sense that, most likely you sense that you're looking from a point somewhere behind your eyes. So And normally this point of origin is within the volume of our defined body, or the body itself, if you will. But actual experiments were able to demonstrate otherwise, which is quite interesting. So he says the fundamental sense of selfhood is found at the location of the visual body representation. So, in other words, the self you feel you have is located where you perceive a visual body representation of yourself. So, in the waking state, this is the body you perceive. When you wear virtual reality glasses, this can shift, to a virtual body that you see when you wear those glasses. And in the case of OBEs, this can be an entirely hallucinated body, so hovering over your physical body, so to speak. Metzinger then talks about so-called phantom limbs, the phenomenon of phantom limbs, and this further corroborates the idea of, our bodily self model being virtual. So I'm not going to go into that here. So what essentially Metzinger and his colleagues were able to show with all these experiments is that the minimal conditions for us to have a sense of self are So he concludes self-consciousness must be something very local, something in the brain itself, and it is independent of motor control of moving your body. And if we were to sort of sum this up and dumb it down at the same time, you could say all you need is a brain in a vat. And I think, that's an interesting idea to entertain, to ponder. If technically, we could all be brains in vats. That's quite a dystopian idea, but nevertheless we have to think about it. Anyway, that was it for today. I hope you were able to take something away from this video, and in chapter 4 we will take a step from ownership towards agency. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.